You should take all of it, an authoritative voice sounded into the air. Eh? You heard me, everything. But what about the villagers? They're your villagers, you can do whatever you want with them. Moo. Chief Ises scratched his chin in thought at Ilishnish's statement, and Ludmilla sighed. The three of them were standing on the shadowed slope above the dried reeds of the valley floor, northeast of the first farming village. Roughly 5 kilometers further on, the first of the lizardman villages was being assembled. The wooden pilings that suspended the village above where the water's surface would be in the future had already been driven into the ground by an iron golem. The lizardmen were now working to lay out the planks that made up the lowest level of their new homes. She had parted ways with Ilishnish the previous night, allowing her time to become familiar with her new mountain home. The frost dragon returned around noon in her snow elf appearance, looking quite a bit less timid than before. After a brief series of questions, Ludmilla discovered that, in addition to her native Draconic, Ilishnish was highly fluent in the language of the Azalesian mountain dwarves, and had the equivalent to an average human commoner's grasp of the Riastais language used in Irantal. No, that wasn't right. She had a decent grasp of Riastais script, but her speech was atrocious. It was the opposite of the average subject of Riastais, which had a mostly illiterate population. Having a dragon pretending to be an elf speaking a human language with a dwarven accent, which she asserted was closer to human language than her native language, was distracting to the extreme, so she decided to keep her lessons in language separate from everything else until it had been polished to an acceptable degree. Aside from her grasp of language, she had picked up a quirky sort of interpretation regarding the customs of the city and its mostly human population. Beyond that, Ludmilla could only see that they had a long road ahead of them. That aside, she somewhat expected something like her response to their current topic out of her. Though they might not be entirely accurate, the tales of dragons nearly always painted them as vain and greedy beings. What she had not considered was the idea that Chief Ises would not dismiss Ilishnish's statement out of hand. "What do you propose to do with everything you take?" Ludmilla asked. "Why, keep it, of course," Ilishnish said in a matter-of-fact tone. "Treasures are to be hoarded, it's only natural." "So everything will just sit there?" Ludmilla's voice turned deadpan. "That's right," Ilishnish nodded. "But it won't be doing anything." "Of course it will be doing something," Ilishnish scoffed. "It will be sitting there, as proper treasure should." Ludmilla's gaze turned to Chief Ises, who blinked at her nervously in return. Lizardmen didn't have a penchant for amassing idle wealth, did they? The topic of their discussion had to do with some information that the Lizardman chief managed to retrieve regarding the productivity of the Great Lakes fish farms. If she were to be honest, the records that were provided were not so great, being taken in the non-standard measures that were historically used by their people. Still, it was something tangible to work with. Going by what the figures loosely translated out to, the space she had allocated for use by the Lizardmen would easily be able to support 5 villages. The villages and their fish farms were arranged so that they only occupied a small percentage of the southern, marshy half of the newly shaped floor of the vale. With only 160 villagers to start with, Chief Ises estimated that it would take a century or two to occupy what had been granted to him, and he conveyed that the villagers were quite pleased with the arrangement. Inevitably, the discussion went to the collection of revenues, at which point Ilishnish grew keenly interested. "The village will be producing fish," Ludmilla said. "If you just leave them there, they will rot." "Not if they're frozen." "The purpose of collecting revenues," Ludmilla told her, "is to maintain the working state of one's fief and promote further development with the excess. Just keeping it all for your personal use is short-sighted and unproductive. The goal is to create a prosperous domain so that you may collect more revenues from it in the future." "Don't humans have some sort of proverb concerning that?" Ilishnish said, "A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush," or some such. "You have an obligation to put your land to productive use, if possible. Maintaining it is a part of that, and investing excess revenues for promising ventures will not ruin you. It will not do to remain stagnant. It is not a very pleasant position to be in, believe you me." "Well, let's say we entertain your strange idea," Ilishnish said. "What can you do with so much fish?" Ludmilla resisted the impulse to narrow her eyes at the frost dragon's words. Did Lady Shiltier have to put up with this sort of insolence? The idea that she might only irritated Ludmilla all the further, and she took a calming breath before speaking again. "The Duchy of Riastais is landlocked and lacking in major bodies of water, so the demand for fish is relatively high outside of Warden's Vale. I see, so these fish will be exchanged for coins. That's right, Ludmilla nodded. After that, the coins may be put to productive use, Chiefy says. After I've cleared my debts. He has debts? Elishnish exclaimed incredulously, eyeing Chiefy says up and down. I don't see anything expensive on his person. How did he end up in debt? From the material and labor costs of constructing his new village, Ludmilla replied, as well as from provisioning his people while they settle themselves. Elishnish gazed out at the lizardmen constructing their village. Her brow furrowed, nearly turning into a scowl. What fool would lend someone their wealth for something like this? I did, Ludmilla frowned. Elishnish looked askance at her, then she put on a thoughtful expression. I believe I see what's going on here, Elishnish said. You have somehow tricked this lizard man and his people to take on a debt to you, just so they can indefinitely pay taxes to you in the future. This is quite the scheme you have going on here. Once they're done paying off their debt, you will burden them with a new one, yes? Chiefy Seth's tail went limp and his mouth fell open. He sent a betrayed look in Ludmilla's direction. How can you see it in such a twisted way? Ludmilla said. I'm not wrong, am I? As their liege, I am ultimately responsible for Chiefy Seth and his people. By temporarily waiving the cost of materials and supplies, I am helping them get established as quickly as possible, not foisting some insidious scheme upon them. The debt he holds is only for what he has borrowed. So you don't plan on keeping them in debt to permanently bind them to you? Of course not. A wasted opportunity, Elishnish snorted. My father would have used it to force them to do all sorts of things. Since I am managing land as a knight, can I levy taxes as well? Only with those you hold legally binding contracts with, Ludmilla replied, then an unsettling possibility came upon her. Please do not fly around taxing random people around the countryside. Also, do not coerce people into contracts with you. Elishnish clicked her tongue with a vexed look. Would it be appropriate to poke her now? Ludmilla glanced over at Chiefy Seth. It probably wasn't a good idea. If she impaled a fellow vassal right in front of him, he would probably never recover mentally. Please continue with what you were saying, Chiefy Seth. Yes, my lady. Chiefy Seth straightened. The information from the farms at the Great Lake is promising, but we have no way to move so many fish. Well, before even that, we have no merchants. Not a single one of your villagers is interested in selling the village's goods? Chiefy Seth shook his head. Over time, Ludmilla had learned more about the lizardmen, and one thing of note was that they were generally loath to leave their homes. They were content, now that they were starting to settle into their new land, but it was only through the undeniable might of the Sorceress Kingdom that so many had come to Warden's Vale at all. Though they could be motivated to act out of sorts on a temporary basis, those willing to regularly travel abroad and represent their fellows were exceedingly rare. I think it would be easiest to sell our fish in the harbor town, the lizardman chieftain said. The human merchants that come in the future can handle it from there. I understand that it might result in some disadvantageous prices, but our people have no need for great wealth in the first place. We are content with having a home that is safe to raise our families in, one where our people do not starve. It was an answer that she herself might have given only half a year ago, and it was certainly the way her father thought. I strongly advise that you raise some merchants out of your own number, Ludmilla said. They need not travel very far. The furthest they would need to go is Corlin Harbor, which is just over a day distant by way of the river. Not only will they directly represent your interests, they will be exposed to new goods and ideas that might be beneficial to your people in the future. I don't think I can think that far ahead. It is something that will happen on its own, at least that is how it works for humans. Chiefy Seth's reaction to Elishnish's earlier statement gave her pause over her own assumptions about the lizardmen. Her prevailing thought was that every species that possessed even a bit of intelligence, and many of those that were commonly categorized as lacking in it, still behaved in a manner that was conducive to their kind as a whole. They sought opportunities for themselves and their offspring, and inherently understood on a basic level what was good for their kind. This sort of thinking extended to everything, so long as an individual had a working grasp on what they were being exposed to. The lizardmen seemed no different, seeing the marshy floodplain of Warden's Vale as an ideal location to create a village. Just as a human might see a pastoral vista and start to think about whether it could be cultivated for crops or used to raise livestock, She thought that similar thoughts must have run through the lizardmen's minds when they first laid eyes upon the scenery of the Vale. Her eyes went again to the village being constructed, running over the ring of enclosures being set up round it. Lord Cocytus mentioned that the fish farms being managed at Great Lake were a recent idea, Ludmilla said, one that was brought there by a traveller. Is that true? Yes, my lady, Chiefess nodded. This is true. It was not long before His Majesty came to us that the first one was constructed by a member of my old tribe. Why did this traveller think to do such a thing? Ludmilla asked. Chiefess scratched his chin in thought again. His eyes went to the village as well. Because of the war that happened several years ago, probably, he said. Our small part of the lake was insufficient to feed our numbers, and the 7 tribes became 5. It was only then, when so many had died, that we could survive off of the lake again. Zariasu, the traveler we speak of, must have thought it a way to escape the cycle of starvation and war that we were trapped in. To Ludmilla's knowledge, demi-human tribes tended to expand and wage war on neighboring tribes when their populations grew too large. Lizardmen did not breed prodigiously, like goblins, nor were they notably strong compared to the demi-human and heteromorph tribes that shared the same habitat as them. In addition, they had a mostly placid nature, and could only be riled up through strong influences. The result was that they, as a whole, tended to not act preemptively to solve their problems. They could only compete with one another when those problems came. It would only take some badly timed event to wipe them out. Ludmilla suspected that this traveler's radical, as far as lizardmen went, thinking had influenced more than just their food situation. How did your people receive him? At first, Chiefess's tail swished over the grass. Not well. Things didn't go as well as he had expected. The enclosures would break and the fish would escape. Monsters and beasts would come and raid the farm while he was away for an easy meal. He even ended up with a farm full of dead fish a few times. My parents told me how foolish he was, that he was playing with our precious food. If he was not so strong, and if he was not the chief's brother, the villagers might have gone and killed him to put an end to his wastefulness. Do they still feel that way? No, he let out a hissing chuckle. It took Zariasu over a year to figure things out, but, once he started seeing some success, the people quickly changed their minds. No one considers the fish farms foolish anymore. You mentioned that he was Chieftain Shosh's brother, Ludmilla said. Did he use his authority to assist with the development of the fish farms? Yes, Chiefess nodded. He was very assertive about it. The priests, the hunters, even the common folk were told to help out. All they could do was complain outside of his hearing. Personally, I think Chief Shosh's decisiveness on the matter was an admirable thing. It is a sort of courage that I can only aspire to. Ludmilla nodded. To take risks in uncertain times, one did need a certain sort of courage. It was magnified by several degrees when one was responsible for many. With Chiefess's account, Ludmilla could confidently reason that lizardmen did indeed hold some of the same basic lines of thinking as many other races when it came to their own. While they are not exactly travelers, Ludmilla said, merchants, through their work, are exposed to the world beyond in a similar fashion. Through the measures that they develop for themselves, they will also see products and ideas that hold value for their businesses or those they are associated with. A human is not a lizard man, so one will never fully understand what a lizard man sees as desirable. By the same token, a human merchant will not perceive what they are exposed to by the same measures as a lizard man merchant. You need not send them far away to begin with, just having them conduct their trade around the Vale is a perfectly respectable start. Will they find ideas just by working around here, my lady? Zariasu went far beyond the lake. I am not a lizard man, Ludmilla shrugged, so I cannot say if they will find anything of value to your people. What I can say is that you will never know if no one goes out there. New ideas and ways of thinking are abundant in the Sorceress Kingdom. It would be both embarrassing and sad to see you carry on in isolation, ignorant of the things that could change your lives for the better not a few hours away. But even if ideas come, Chiefess said, they are difficult to adopt. Zariasu was met with much scorn and ridicule, and the path to success was filled with failure. To support these people is your job as chief, yes? Ludmilla told him, just as Chief Shasha supported this Zariasu. Identifying beneficial ideas that are presented to you by those who return is an important task. Not only must you consider what may or may not work for your people, but you must also be in a position to support the efforts to develop them. How you manage your revenues is a crucial component of this. Your people must be left with enough to support themselves, your fief needs to be maintained, and the excess used to explore avenues that might lead to greater prosperity. Chiefess was silent for a long moment, seemingly digesting her words. Elishnish stood beside her with an unreadable expression. Did this sort of thinking make any sense to a dragon? Maybe she was composing some elaborate scheme that only mimicked the ideas presented in a shallow way. I should leave you to your work, Ludmilla told the lizardman chief. Was our discussion enough to help you figure out how to structure your tenant contracts? It gives me a lot to think about, Chiefess replied. I must reconsider many things now. Once I have come up with a new outline, I will present it to you for review. I am glad to have been of assistance, Ludmilla said. I will be in my manor if you have anything further to discuss. I have a pile of work waiting for me, as well. One question, if I may, Chiefess said. What is it? Do you do this as well? Everything you spoke of. House Zaradnik was not in a position to do everything I mentioned until recently, but this is something that I do now, yes. Is it something that all human lords do? Was it? She didn't think that it was. Lady Shiltir had mentioned something about her being compelled to act according to the classes that she possessed. Even if this was the case, however, it was clear that the behavior of different nobles at least hinged on their perception of the world, after which their skills as nobles came into effect. The result was that nobles varied widely, to the point that it was nearly impossible to tell that they were being influenced by their class unless one was aware of the notion that Lady Shiltir had presented. Not all human lords think the same way, Ludmilla told him. As for myself, I am blessed with a very dear friend who is unmatched at this sort of thing. A scribed message with the seal of the Adventurer Guild lay upon Ludmilla's desk when she returned to the manor. She swept the parchment up in her left hand as she walked by, idly unsealing it as she made her way to the back. Her lips turned down into a frown as she reviewed the content while Willuvian removed her scarf and worked to fix her hair. They withdrew, she murmured. Who withdrew? Elishnish's voice sounded in her ear. Ludmilla froze, then glanced over her shoulder, finding Elishnish peeking down at the document. The frost dragon had been undetectable to her senses, even when she was standing less than a meter away. Is there a reason why you are concealing your presence? Ludmilla asked. I'm following a person I just met last night into a strange, dark place, Elishnish answered. Is this not reason enough? As far as Ludmilla knew, dragons could see in complete darkness just as well as she. In terms of the broader context, however, Elishnish was probably correct, aside from the fact that Ludmilla was not a stranger, but her new liege. She wondered when any semblance of trust would begin to develop. Acting in such a manner may be construed as distrust in your host, Ludmilla told her. People may also accuse you of suspicious behavior. But it's perfectly natural behavior. Elishnish protested. House Zaradnik is full of rangers, so I understand where you are coming from. I have to purposely avoid concealing myself in certain situations as well. Some people will also scare easily if you abruptly reveal yourself, despite your intentions. That's their problem, not mine. Why should I change my behavior for the sake of others? Learning all of the reasons why is a part of why you've been sent here, Ludmilla said. Understanding and employing the appropriate behavior for every circumstance should not be viewed as a burden or nuisance. Forms of etiquette ensure that communication occurs smoothly between parties, and are tools to be employed to your advantage. Elishnish offered nothing in response, and Ludmilla returned to reading the message from the Adventurer Guild. The expedition to Fiorizo had withdrawn, having encountered frost giants at an unexpected location roughly 40 kilometers south of the Dwarven mining outpost. The outcome was not as bad as she had predicted. The adventurers only suffered 6 fatalities. They were now licking their wounds in Erantal and retraining while the leadership considered their next move. What does it say? Elishnish asked. Lady Shiltir mentioned that you had registered with the Adventurer Guild? Yes, that's right. I'm still not qualified to participate in the expeditions, though. So she could follow rules set down by those other than His Majesty and Lady Shiltir. Was it because of Lord Mayor and Lady Aura? Raw power appeared to be something that could compel her to conduct herself properly. The expedition in progress has withdrawn to recuperate in Erantal, Ludmilla told her. Is that so? Elishnish said. They were conducting diplomacy with some frost giants when I saw them last. How strange that they've returned so soon. You saw them? Oh yes, they were in the middle of something when I was delivering supplies. I returned to the city shortly after that. Ludmilla wondered what had gone wrong. Did they offend the frost giants somehow? She couldn't imagine the adventurers going out of their way to pick a fight. They should have been well aware of the frost giant's strength. Taking a seat at the table, she bid Elishnish join her. Her vassal carefully walked around the table once before sitting down. How much do you know about frost giants? Ludmilla asked. Did those rumors you spread hold any truth to them? The truth? Elishnish tilted her head. The soul cannot lie. I have heard that from someone before, Ludmilla said, but what does that have to do with the rumor that you spread? It was the result of a bardic performance, was it not? To be sure, Ludmilla had heard minstrels wax poetic, claiming that their art was drawn from the soul or something similar to enamor others to them. Then they would launch themselves into some ridiculous fabrication that no one could seriously believe. It would please me if you do not equate a dragon bard with mortal bards, Elishnish snorted, twirling a strand of frost-white hair around a finger. Mortal bards are but a pale imitation. How so? The finger stopped. Elishnish looked at her as if she had come across something bizarre and incomprehensible. What part of dragon do you not understand? You were actually the first dragon I have ever spoken to. Elishnish's long look continued until she finally closed her eyes and released a sigh. Our kind is unique in its relationship to the world, Elishnish told her. I often hear mortal races frame us in simplistic terms, so I suppose what we are might simply be beyond your capability to understand. Our place in this world cannot be won by physical prowess or magical might. Our connection to this world is not something that other races can achieve through any effort. The greatest of our kind are the keepers of this world. Even if someone somehow manages to slay one, they cannot gain what the world has lost. I have never heard anything like that before. Why would you? Elishnish said, you, who can only think about whether we ate your stupid cow last night, what rank of adventurer it would take to fight us, or what you might gain from our deaths. The stewards of your race's law would almost certainly dismiss it out of hand in their ignorance and conceit. The tone in which she spoke was laced with disdain, yet woven within her words was the sense that Elishnish was conveying a truth intrinsic to existence itself. It was reminiscent of the feeling that Ludmilla had when the Chronos spoke to her, yet it had a unique aspect to it that she had never experienced before. At first blush, it came off as arrogant and cryptic, but, now being exposed to two races that expressed themselves in somewhat similar terms, she thought that there might be something more to it. To them, what was, you either understood, or you did not. I would very much like to discuss this with you at length, Ludmilla said, if it helps me understand you better. This is something that will have to wait, however. The Adventurer Guild wants me to participate in the next leg of the expedition. Why, you're an adventurer? Elishnish's voice suddenly turned timid, and its mystical quality drifted away. I thought you were a noble, or was that a ranger? I find that I am many things these days, Ludmilla smirked. More recently, people have been seeing me as one of the undead. Elishnish sniffed at her suspiciously. Wiluvian, who was serving them tea, bestowed a frown of condemnation upon her. Are you? Elishnish asked. I think I would realize if something like that happened, Ludmilla answered. At any rate, with this upcoming expedition, I would like to learn more about frost giants, if you don't mind. They're big, blue, and violent. Is there anything else you need to know? I was thinking more along the lines of their culture, Ludmilla explained, how their tribes work, and how they conduct battle. Elishnish made a face. Her true appearance also somehow made the same face. Why would you want to know this? She asked. They're killing you, so just kill them back. That is not the purpose of the expedition, Ludmilla answered. We will fight if it comes to it, but the purpose of the new Adventurer Guild is not to subjugate those we come across, but to explore the world. Diplomacy is preferable to conquest. To begin with, do you know how the diplomatic efforts of the expedition failed yesterday? They didn't. They didn't? They didn't, Elishnish said, but I don't think they would have been able to keep it up, now that I think about it. That's probably why they withdrew. Her confusion over the matter apparently solved, Elishnish allowed herself a self-satisfied nod. Just to be clear, Ludmilla frowned, what sort of diplomacy was this? The aggressive sort. Maybe it was something she should have expected from the start. For many demi-human tribes, Respect was only earned through feats of strength. Without respect, you were just food. Let me guess, Ludmilla sighed, you have to keep fighting them until you make a name for yourself. Until then, you're just a target. Obviously, there was no way a regular expedition would be able to do that. Their primary objective was not the frost giants themselves, so fielding the sixth team with suitably powerful individuals like Moman and Nobe was probably not on the table. Perhaps a new expedition meant to specifically deal with them would be sent out in the future. Out of curiosity, Ludmilla said. Would you be capable of doing this? If you were qualified for the expedition, of course. They already have a name for me, Elishnish said, but doing what you're probably asking is far beyond my reach. There are some frost giants out there that are at least as strong as my mother, never mind me. What do they call you? It's extraordinarily presumptuous, so I'd rather not say. Ludmilla couldn't imagine what sort of name could be presumptuous to the extent that even a dragon thought it so. Her answer sealed off the one possibility she could think of for the adventurer expedition to deal with the frost giants. As with the initial expectations that came with this expedition, they could only focus on the survey and pray that frost giants did not notice and come after them. I would still like to learn as much as possible, Ludmilla said. They are beyond my experience, so any accurate information will help me figure out ways for the expedition to survive them. If your goal is to survive, Elishnish replied, then just avoid them entirely. Their veteran hunters are superior to your rangers, so you have little chance to elude them once they take notice of you. A single one of their champions is enough to destroy your entire expedition a dozen times over if it is similar to what was sent yesterday. How about their culture and religion? Ludmilla asked, what do you know about those? They have gods, of a sort, Elishnish answered. I am not sure whether they consider them members of their own race or something else. Foremost amongst them is Thrym, whom they also consider their king. They have a god that lives amongst them? Ludmilla's eyes narrowed. Not that I know of. He is a myth from ages past, when many mighty beings existed in the world. Like us frost dragons, frost giants came to the Azalisia Mountains a long time ago. Whether this Thrym exists in some other place is unknown, but frost giants only live for about as long as dwarves do. Ludmilla wondered if the frost giant religion had any similarities to her own. The 6 great gods had come to live amongst humanity 6 centuries ago, protecting them during a time when humans were on the brink of being overwhelmed by their non-human neighbors. They mingled with humanity, and their blood ran through the veins of many to this day. Sursana, the god of death, was not a human, but, because of this, he was the one who had stayed with humanity the longest. If not for the 8 greed kings, who had visited calamity upon the world a century after the 6 great gods' advent, Sursana would still be with them today. Many of the faithful believed that their gods would someday descend to live with them once more. Do they have any other gods? Ludmilla asked, what about something like an afterlife? The other gods are much like the ones you might find elsewhere, Elishnish yawned. They are all related to the frost giants somehow, and these gods reign over various aspects of their lives. As for the afterlife, they believe that the souls of the worthy will be chosen to join their most honored ancestors in the halls of their afterlife. Or was it the fields? The latter doesn't make much sense to me, considering where they live. Since they have such a warlike culture, I am guessing that worthy has something to do with their feats of strength in life. Oh, yes, their entire society revolves around it. Feats of strength and death in glorious combat against other worthy foes and all that. How have they not fought their way into glorious extinction if this is the case? Because they're strong? Elishnish gave her obviously look again, so strong that only dragons and other giants may be considered proper rivals for them as a species. Internally, they adhered to traditions that are reinforced by the very strength that they aspire to. There is an order to everything, dictated by strength, who may challenge who, what targets are worth raiding and who they are appropriate for, who may speak and represent their kin in council. I am beginning to understand why you called it diplomacy. It is not difficult to grasp, Elishnish snorted. If anything, this should be the norm for the world, no? For primitive tribal societies, perhaps, Ludmilla said. True civilizations have risen above such base thinking. Humph. These primitive tribal societies that you look down upon have stood the test of time, unlike your civilization. How long have the kingdom and the empire been around? Less than 2 centuries, I think. Eventually, Something strong will come and take everything if you do not possess the strength to match, and that's exactly what happened, if I'm not mistaken. It was difficult to refute her words. The Sorcerer King won his claim to the Duchy of Erantal through overwhelming force. The empire established itself through rebellion against Rheastais. Rheastais was built on the rubble of the nations destroyed by the demon gods. With enough strength, one could kill even gods. The faith of the Six promotes the cultivation of humanity's strength. Ludmilla turned to the only example that she knew that stood apart from the rest, and the slain theocracy has stood for many centuries. They did not need a warlike culture to achieve this. Speaking of which, how does the priesthood fit into Frost Giant society? The priesthood? It doesn't exist in the same way as the clergy do in Erantal. Their shamans function as their priesthood. I would think that the priesthood would be central to such a violently spiritual people. Violence is central to such a violently spiritual people, Elishnish corrected her. Their pursuit of a glorious afterlife is the closest thing to worship that they have. So there is no way to approach the Frost Giants through their priests. You're still thinking about talking to them? Elishnish rolled her eyes. If the only outcome of their traditional diplomacy is being crushed, Ludmilla told her, then I have no choice but to seek alternatives, should the situation call for it. Elishnish remained silent for a time, and Ludmilla reread the details on the Adventurer Guild's message. Depending on the circumstances, Elishnish finally broke the silence. You might be able to speak with one. Have you done this before? Ludmilla asked. How do you think I know all of these frivolous little details? Elishnish answered. Probably by killing them and going through their belongings. Well, I did that too, Elishnish admitted, but one has to confirm what they come across. I am not your average, mortal bard, spewing uninspired tales of dubious veracity. I do not suppose you could bring me to meet this frost giant shaman. Of course not, Elishnish replied. Why would I leave a perfectly healthy frost giant alive? They're late. They are, Sigurd replied, but that doesn't mean anything in itself. We're frost giants, not dwarves. Gudrun looked up from tending to their wounded son. He had come home with a meter-long gash on the outside of his thigh, the result of sparring with the other young warriors of the settlement. Coming back with wounds was a regular thing for those in training, but Sigurd's wife always had a halfway annoyed expression when it happened. Probably because she was the one that had to heal it. Cure serious wounds. After Gudrun had finished inspecting the wound, the glow of healing magic washed over the boy. The gash closed, leaving only the unmarred blue flesh of his thigh and the torn section of his leggings. Gudrun glowered at that too. Weren't you the one who was convinced that a new calamity would come from the south? She asked after sending their son on his way. I still am, Sigurd answered, but I'm also of the mind that a calamity should be more calamitous. I expect nothing less than the mountain to fall on our heads. Since it hasn't yet, there's no reason to worry. Let them do their thing. They're a scouting party, and the foothills are full of tribes to raid. You sent them to look for signs of danger, Gudrun noted, not to raid. I did, Sigurd nodded, but the accounts of those few that witnessed the last calamity and survived were very clear. The nations of the lowlanders burned first, their cities sending up great columns of smoke over the entire horizon. The scouts were instructed to return if they noticed any sign of this. So you're letting them run wild down there until then? Their task is simple, Sigurd told her, and I will not deny them their right to raid if they find something worthy of their attention. We haven't been down there for years, so there should be plenty to fight by now. The tribes in the mountain valleys have been thinned out, so there's not much to fight or plunder there. Why the sudden wariness, anyways? This is something that you'd normally encourage. A feeling. A feeling, like an omen? Perhaps, Gudrun sighed. The last few decades have been so bad that I find it difficult to discern anything out of the ordinary. Sigurd rose from his seat in the hall, a stony expression painting his face. Nearby, several of his family members moved to attend to him. He waved them away. I won't be long, he said. If anyone comes looking for me, tell them that they can find me at the top of the southeastern approach. It was not until he made his way out of the icy longhouse and well outside of the settlement that he blew out a weary sigh through his pale white beard. It was not a sigh that spoke of physical or mental exhaustion, but the sort that he thought must come from the soul, one eroded from long decades of worry. No one but his wife and the Jarl ever saw this side of him. To most, he was the bold champion of the Frost Reaver tribe. Hope, Jarl Frostreaver turned his regular, audacious statements, but to Sigurd, it was feeling more and more like desperation, no matter the words he used. His hope was the salvation of his kind, war. The strife and chaos that would rouse his people from their complacency and call them to glory once again. Conflict to revive their strength and rejuvenate their thinning blood, lest they fall so far that the way to the afterlife was forever closed to them. Even now, he wondered what their honored ancestors would think of their descendants' current state. Preying on the weak tribes below was not enough, and true challenges were few and far between. His people had grown toothless and did not even war between themselves. The dwarves had made powerful new allies, the same ones that had seemingly subjugated the frost dragons, but nothing had developed out of the tribe's decision to confront them. Indeed, it seemed like their complacency had anchored them to inaction once again, and they were content with simply watching whatever was going on in the dwarven passes. Did they think that they could remain in that state forever? Just as the weaker denizens of the Azalizia Mountains remained at the mercy of the frost giants, the strong had the privilege of exercising their power on a whim. Waiting for this strong newcomer to do something to them was bound to end in some disaster. A challenge was in order, to settle where each side stood before inaction was perceived as weakness and the newcomers moved to take everything. Gunnar Frostreaver, the Jarl's son and the representative sent to lead their warriors at the gathering of the tribes, should have understood this very well. Perhaps he was being snubbed by the rest of the tribes due to the Frostreaver's weakened influence. Sigurd came to the top of the glacier that flowed down into the southeastern approach after an hour's journey. Below, the pass that stretched from east to west looked the same as it always had, icy, windblown and filled with all manner of lesser undead. The foothills and forests to the east showed no evidence of being greatly disturbed, nor did any signs of devastation rise from the lowlands beyond. If not for the threats that loomed in his mind, it would have passed for another bright and frozen day. Scanning the landscape, he looked for the hunters that were stationed on the lookouts. With the younger, more inexperienced ones out scouting below, the veterans had taken their posts. He squinted in annoyance. They were much harder to spot as they stood their quiet vigil, some impossibly so. After some time, he finally managed to find one, not by spotting them from afar, but walking to a common lookout spot near one of the cliffs overlooking the glacier until he finally came close enough to spot her. Thane, the huntress, Brunhild, nodded. She sat with her legs dangling over the lookout, one arm resting on a pile of boulders. Unlike the young sentries that were usually placed to watch over the pass, the veterans were more adept at hurling boulders from a great distance and were significantly more relaxed in their approach to destroying any notably strong undead that manifested. "Bird still out?" Sigurd asked. "Yep," Brunhild replied. "Gudrun had me send her further out, but she should be back any time now. What's she so worried about, anyway? Those kids have only been out for a week, and there's plenty for them to fight down there." "I said something like that as well," Sigurd said, "but she has a feeling." The huntress frowned and scanned the horizon with a grim expression. Sigurd snorted in amusement. "I swear you all take her more seriously than you do me," he said. "She's the village shaman," Brunhild smirked. "You're just the village meathead." Sigurd barked out a laugh. She wasn't too far off. He might be a champion of the tribe, but life outside of warfare mostly revolved around their mystics, who stood outside of the hierarchy of strength. Beyond that, Gudrun just wasn't someone that anyone wanted to get on the bad side of. A speck appeared against the greenery of the foothills, growing larger as it rose to their altitude. The huntress bird wasn't actually a bird, it was a periton. The magical beast was something like a cross between an eagle and a demonic stag, sporting a full rack of sharpened horns on its deer-like head. It sat upon the pile of boulders beside the huntress, silently conversing with its mistress in the strange way that hunters and their companions did. After a few minutes, the periton settled down more comfortably on the boulders and started to preen its feathers. Brunhild stood up to face Sigurd. "Looks like something got him," she said. "Looks like?" "Yeah," she nodded. "There's signs of a battle in the foothills about 50 kilometers southeast of here, ending in a forest clearing. There aren't any bodies, but the damage from the fighting is clearly from our scouts, unless there's some other giant tribe running around down there." The possibility of that was slim. The Frostreaver tribe was the only surviving frost giant tribe of the southern ranges. "What about the other side?" Sigurd asked. "Who did they fight?" "Something hobgoblin-sized, going by their tracks." The huntress paused to look over her shoulder at the Periton. It wasn't hobgoblins, going by the smell. Hobgoblin-sized, but not hobgoblins. Sigurd's gaze turned eastward. Humans? Humans? Brunhild wrinkled her nose. Besides their having no business being there, humans are soft. Remember the ones we used to raid up on the Dwarven Highway? Humans once traded regularly with the dwarves, but their activity had declined sharply in recent decades. From what he remembered, even the guards that they sent with their caravans were mostly weak. Certainly, there were a few that might match a weaker frost giant, but he had never seen so many that they could wipe out a large scouting party like the one that had just met its demise. That their opponent had the luxury of cleaning up the battlefield so thoroughly suggested that they were of notable strength, but they were still not remotely qualified to be some catastrophic threat. "It's your call, Thane," Brunhild prompted him. "What do we do?" Sigurd snorted at the edge of anticipation in her voice. It wasn't something that he had heard in a long time. "We'll have to check and make sure nothing is going on along the other approaches first," Sigurd told her. "If they turn up with nothing, we'll send some stronger parties down. You'll want to be a part of that, I'm guessing." "Damn straight," she grinned. "I haven't had a good fight in 30 years. He left her to her excitement, setting off to check with the other hunters along the southern pass. Within a day, they determined that there was nothing else of significance in any direction their tribe was responsible for. Upon returning to the longhouse, Gudrun looked up from her work and peered at him suspiciously. "I knew it," she said. "I haven't seen you so giddy in half a century." "The scouting party was wiped out with no remains left behind," Sigurd said. "The excitement of the veterans is just a bit infectious. They're all clamoring to be the next." Gudrun rose from her seat, wiping her hands on her apron. "How many do you plan on sending now?" she asked. 3 parties of 10, Sigurd answered. "We have no idea where our new friends went, so they'll be sent to cover a wide area." "Who will keep watch over the pass?" Well, they might miss each other down there, so my warband will stand over our part of the pass. The other Danes should be taking care of their own." "How greedy can you?" Gudrun started, then sighed at his wide grin. "How long until all this happens?" "It will take a few days to arrange provisions for the scouting parties," Sigurd replied, "but I'll be taking over at the pass right away so they can rest before they leave. It's too bad that we still don't know what we're up against down there. I'm getting pretty curious about them." Gudrun knelt down to pull aside the quilted rug on the floor. Beneath it was a shallow depression filled with ice. "What names?" Gudrun said as she brushed the surface of the ice clear. "Maybe I can at least find out what you're dealing with by divining the location of the missing remains or their belongings." Sigurd listed the members of the scouting party as Gudrun continued her preparations. From the chest near Sigurd's seat in the hall, she retrieved a black cowl fashioned out of some unknown material. It was an heirloom of his family, passed down through at least 3 generations. One of its effects was that it foiled all attempts at gathering information on the wearer by divination spells and effects. It also protected against all mind-affecting spells and abilities. There were a few other benefits, and it served as a powerful item that protected one from various types of magic that were commonly used against giants. As a shaman, Gudrun used it to render herself immune to counter-divination attempts when she herself was scrying. She donned the cowl and held out a hand. "Summon Monster Eye." A tiny fire elemental flickered to life before them, and she directed it to the ice. Spells existed that could change the temperature of water, but they didn't last in the frozen climes where frost giants made their homes. When the pool had completed thawing, Gudrun took a deep breath and cast another spell. Scrying. They waited in silence for a full minute before Gudrun's focused look relaxed. "What happened?" Sigurd asked. "The spell only works on live targets," Gudrun said. "So they're either dead or under some sort of counter-divination effect." "I thought the cowl protects against divination." "Divination against the wearer, yes," Gudrun told him. "The target of my scrying spell was not the wearer of the cowl." "I knew that." Gudrun shot him a look before falling into thought again. After a moment, she cast another spell. Locate object. Another minute passed. As with the scrying spell, it appeared that Gudrun had failed. Her face carried a vexed expression as she muttered to herself. Who would ward something like that against divination? "What did you search for?" Sigurd asked. "A trinket that one of the people you listed always carried around," Gudrun answered. Either the person who fought this scouting party is absurdly cautious and has mana to spare, or all of the remains are under a larger effect that prevents attempts at divination. Gudrun dismissed the fire elemental and a thin film of ice covered the pool within seconds. What does that mean, exactly? Sigurd asked. Exactly? I'm not sure, Gudrun answered. They at least have some sort of powerful magic caster in their number if they can block me off so completely, maybe more than one. She removed the cowl and held it out between them. Make sure you have this on out there, Gudrun told him. I'm confident that you can account for yourself properly against a warrior, but a magic caster is another thing entirely. Gudrun reached over and fastened the cowl around his shoulders. Sigurd thought to make a quip over how she was being overly serious about him standing watch just an hour away, but the look in her pale blue eyes stilled his tongue. As a powerful vulva, her omens were not something to be treated so frivolously. Fight well, husband, she said. Should I be so lucky to meet my match, he replied. I shall await you in the halls of our honored ancestors.